welcome to our next session, Decarbonizing Industries within Planetary Boundaries. I am Blanca Chocarro, Senior Manager, Strategic Projects at EIT Manufacturing, the largest European innovation ecosystem for manufacturing industries, where we aim to accelerate the sustainable innovation in Europe. And it is a great pleasure for me to be here moderating the next 1 hour and a half session, a very busy session, where we will be discussing about circular economy, innovation, and collaboration across the entire value chains, and how we can define a strategy to set net zero goals. And for that, let's just start with a keynote speech from Eva Gladek. She is the founder and CEO of Metabolic, a consulting and venture-building company that uses systemic thinking to tackle major sustainability challenges. And she will be discussing on how we can bring industry back to its fundamentally sustainable and circular state. So Eva, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? All right, great. So it's a great pleasure to be here today. And I am going to be talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is how to look at problems systemically. So of course, we know it's really critical to decarbonize, but we need to do that while not aggravating other important planetary boundaries, like biodiversity loss, water stress, land use. And for that, we need to take a systemic lens. I am trying to get this clicker to work. Just 1 second. This is not working. Where do I need to point this? Okay. Where do I point this? Where do I point it? Here? Okay. All right. So it's still not working, sorry. Okay. All right, I hope that this works a little better moving forward. But so I run an organization called Metabolic. It's a systems change agency. We work across many different dimensions. We do advisory work, research, and build ventures, so do quite a lot of applied projects. And our overall mission is to bring the economy within planetary boundaries. I was not always planning on working in this field. This is really honestly not working. Sorry, I can't really make this happen. Huh? Where? Who do I need to tell? Okay, I have a lot of slides. Okay. So when I started out my career, I was passionate about biology, and I started working in labs, and what you see here are 2 flasks of bacteria. One of them is very clear, the one on the right, and the one on the left is cloudy because there's a lot of cells growing in there. And I had this very visceral experience of exponential growth and what that meant because of this. Well, I would have to take a sample of bacteria from one flask and put it into the fresh one and wait for 24 hours for the cells to grow. And for the first 23 and a half hours, it looked like there was nothing happening in this flask. And then in the last half hour, suddenly everything would get cloudy and the cells would be dead if I wasn't careful. And that's because of this exponential growth curve. The flask would go from half full to entirely dead very quickly. All right. And when I went to university to study biology, I ran into these graphs. They're the same exact exponential curves, except they're describing not what's happening in a flask of bacteria that can go from perfectly hospitable to totally dangerous in the snap of a finger, but rather what's happening in our own flask. This got me very concerned. So I decided to switch gears and focus my entire career on figuring out how to bend those exponential curves. I first went into journalism, and then I studied industrial ecology, the science of sustainability. And my first question was, how close are we to the limit of the system? And that's when I encountered this framework, the Planetary Boundaries. Can I see a show of hands for those of you who have heard of the Planetary Boundaries framework? That's great. So in a session on this topic. There's a lot of you. So this describes 9 main Earth systems that have to be kept in a safe operating space for the planet to be livable. That's not even a great goal. And as you can see, we have crossed most of them. 6 out of the 9 are in the red zone. We are crossing critical tipping points in the climate system, but also in many other systems across the board. So as we get further and further into the red zone, we are actually achieving points of no return, such as the Amazon may turn into a savanna in the coming period just because the water cycle is so disrupted. However, it's not just about climate, because actually other areas are more, the planetary boundaries are even worse transgressed than the climate ones. And one of the main drivers behind this is the material extraction that is fueling our economy. So in 2020, for the first time, the amount of man-made material in our economy exceeded the total amount of natural material. Imagine that, all trees, plants, animals, and we have actually been making more stuff than the natural system makes itself. And this exponential increase in material consumption is one of the main things that's driving carbon emissions, but also a lot of the other planetary boundary transgressions. So one of the main things that we need to see is that actually to drive these bends of those exponential curves, we need to identify exponential solutions. Now, we are currently deploying more capital than ever toward positive systems change, but it's not working. So that investment line is not actually resulting in that bend in those curves. We still see waste increasing, material use increasing. The only thing that's sort of flattening is carbon emissions, but the other things are continuing to go in the wrong direction. And the reason for that, at least our deep conviction, is that we're not applying a systemic lens to these problems. We are looking at a single problem and optimizing for that, and then there's more problems that emerge. So there's a few pitfalls of not using systems thinking that I'm going to quickly share. The first we call efficiency rather than effectiveness. So there was a Japanese consumer products company that heard that we needed to reduce our total carbon footprint by 10-fold. And they said, OK, well, let's look at our entire product portfolio, and each of those products we're going to make 10 times more efficient. And you can take that approach, or you can ask, do all those products actually need to exist? So this is an electric pepper mill. And you can ask, OK, do we really need to make this thing 10 times more efficient, or do we maybe not need an electric pepper mill? And there's a lot of arguments to say that, OK, people have arthritis, et cetera, but it's an example to point out the sub-optimization. Another key thing is burden shifting. So if you know these technologies for lighting, we have the incandescent bulb, which is very common in the past, which has a beautiful light spectrum and it produces a lot of heat, but it's very energy inefficient. And now in Europe, we've mostly switched to the middle solution or the LED. The middle one is also known as a mercury bulb. So you trade one problem, which is energy use, for another, which is toxicity, because mercury is actually a neurotoxin. So this is the example of burden shifting, where if you're looking at just one solution instead of the whole problem, you start to shift burdens. I'm going to skip this one because I think, well, actually, maybe I'll just mention it quickly. So this is about rebound effects. You may have heard that bioplastics are this cool new solution for, well, they're not new anymore, but a lot of people really focus on eliminating fossil fuels and say, OK, well, let's make things out of bioplastic. But actually, so much of our agriculture is deeply fueled by fossil fuels that 98 of the 100 calories of a cob of corn are actually fossil fuel derived. And so then if you take that corn, which is 98% fossil fuels, you process it and turn it into a plastic, which adds a lot more fossil fuel energy in that process, you end up with a plastic bottle that has more oil in it than a normal plastic bottle made directly of oil. And so this is an example of a rebound effect. So we need to look at these solutions not as point problems, not at just one technology or one kind of issue. We actually need to look at the system. There's no such thing as a sustainable, decarbonized, circular product. there can only be sustainable, decarbonized, insert your favorite word, product, service, systems, because we have to consider how these things can be used, misused, disposed, and how they intersect with the other infrastructures in our economy. So it's kind of like solving a Rubik's Cube puzzle. If you just try to put one square on the other side where it belongs, you scramble the entire thing. So we need to understand that it's an intersecting algorithm. So how do we take a systemic approach to decarbonizing our economy? So I have two cases, really quickly, and I also need some water. Does anyone have? Oh, yeah. Sorry, I'm trying to project very loud, but that's making my voice a little hoarse. So, okay. The first is around the energy transition and electronics. So one thing that I think is important for us to understand is that a lot of the time we talk about materials and the circular economy as though they're entirely separate from the energy system and other transitions connected to the planetary boundaries. But actually, we believe that the circular economy is an absolute requirement for achieving the energy transition. And there are a few reasons for that. For one, the material demand of the carbon embedded in materials is up to 70% of our total economic footprint. Another is the whole burden shifting issue. And lastly, we actually need key resources that are being lost in the system to achieve the energy transition. So among those, rare earth metals, for example. These are the building blocks of the energy transition and many other key industries. And they're now making the news a lot more because of the trade wars with China. They're used in almost every critical high-tech sector, from smartphones to electric cars, and they're essential for wind turbines, batteries, PV. In 2018, we did a study looking at what is the material demand for each of the different energy transition technologies. And you can see here the relative size by the bubble of the different metals and what is needed in, for example, PV as a kind of case study. Now here, this graph shows how much of this material is coming from specific geographies, in particular from China. You can see the massive dependence. And we looked at, for example, in the Netherlands, if you just wanted to achieve the energy transition goals of just the Netherlands, how much of this material you would need. And what this graph shows is that for some of these materials, like neodymium and terbium, the Netherlands alone would need 2% of global supply. And that is a tiny economy. It does not make sense so obviously that means that we do not have sufficient of this material in active production. So we modeled then how much of this material we would need based on the IPCC models for remaining within 2 degrees. And this was actually several years ago, so that was the goal before. We basically need to open more mines. We need to rapidly circularize the way that the economy is functioning. And there are many different fragilities in the existing system. So opening a mine takes 10 to 20 years. It's also very difficult with the different costs associated with that, the permits. Our recycling rates are currently very low. And this means that in order to crack this problem, we have to take a multifaceted approach. We really have to look at both the production side, the demand side, as well as really a massive adoption of circular principles across the board. And this is just for looking at decarbonization within one dimension, within one set of technologies. So secondly, I'm going to talk about the construction sector, buildings. This is one of the main places where we're consuming materials. On an annual basis, the EU alone is consuming around 1 million kilotons of material, which is enough to build 100,000 Eiffel Towers every year. And that is a massive driver of the carbon footprint here. You can see this graph, how the material is flowing through that system. And when you translate this into sectoral carbon budgets, you start to see that actually the carbon budget for the construction sector in the EU 27 plus UK will run out next year. we are planning so much construction that there's no way to stay within that boundary based on this material demand. So there are possible solutions if you start to look at this more systemically. A lot of people are considering what happens if we move away from very high carbon intensity materials like concrete and steel to bio-based materials like wood. And there's a huge movement to create engineered wood products. So we looked at what if you actually were to replace the demand for a lot of these materials with wood. We actually looked at a high ambition scenario where you would be looking to replace by 2030 100% of most viable construction with bio-based material. We found that the reduction potential, if you maximized it, was around 40% of carbon emissions. So that's the maximum that you could get, which is the same as around 240,000 rocket launches, so not bad. However, what would happen is that it would require a 10-fold increase in engineered wood production, which means adding an area to the EU of harvestable wood around the size of Finland. And that is also considering the fact that we have many other pressures on land that are growing. For example, the need for additional food production as the population grows and also expands its desire to eat certain types of food. Another possibility is actually, rather than building more stuff, replacing it and maximizing recovery of materials from other systems, like existing building stock. And we explored this topic of urban mining. So how can you actually tear down buildings in such a way that you can pull out materials and whole usable models or usable components? We created a model to predict supply and demand in different city contexts to see, okay, well, if we create kind of storage centers for key components like doors and wood frames and put those into storage facilities, how do you match supply and demand in different parts of cities so that you can optimize for this? However, even there we have limitations. What we found is that if you fully recover existing material stock, you can only displace up to 12% of virgin material demand because of the continued increase in demand. And so the massive increase in demand is never going to be satisfied by the kind of small amount of stuff that we're replacing. So we need to start looking at these solutions much more fundamentally, systemically. I am basically going to skip what I want to share as a final thought, because I know I lost a few minutes in the beginning when we were trying to do some maneuvering. But what we've been looking at is, rather than saying, okay, let's replace this one technology with another technology, how do you look at an entire value chain or an entire economy in a particular place to actually create a portfolio of solutions? So you can either look at particular landscapes, so cities and their hinterlands, or you can look at specific sectors and see where you can actually take a different set of solutions, such as, for example, there's a huge demand for new housing in Europe, and that's because of the demand that's being forced by a few specific places, by cities, because rural areas are caving out, people are moving to cities, but actually we have a huge oversupply of buildings in rural areas. And so if there were better strategies for rebalancing population on a longer term, more visionary scale, you could actually structurally reduce the demand for new buildings. And we have to start thinking in this way, because no matter what set of solutions you start to look at in this broader space, you run into barriers. Like I showed, only 12%, even if you have maximum circularity, 100% bio-based, you're still only getting to half of your decarbonization goal for construction. There is no way around it without looking at a broader portfolio. So one of the things that we have been looking at is regional transition strategies, which you can also apply to sectors. So imagine if you look at a whole bioregion that has the production of wood, that has its own water and agricultural supply, and if you look at actually creating a whole kind of economic development strategy that involves really creating new types of businesses. Imagine biorefineries next to healthy forests that are being redeveloped in a way to produce better, longer-lasting wood. You can actually look at rebalancing housing demand, attracting people to rural areas, ensuring longer-term food security strategies, alleviating loneliness and mental health issues because people feel disconnected from nature. The idea is to create multi-solves, things that actually start to address not just one problem for one industry and one sector, but actually start to fundamentally address different issues that we're having across many sectors. Now, this requires real deep collaboration between government, between industries, across different industries, and it requires financial innovation. Because if you want to finance these types of initiatives, you need systemic financing portfolios. So imagine a financial portfolio where you're investing in regenerative agriculture, in new material production, in biorefining, all in a kind of regional context. Now, I know this is only a short moment to share some of these ideas with you. I'm happy to share my slides if any of them are interesting or have further conversations. But I hope that one thing that you've taken away is that we are not taking a systemic approach to solving this problem. We have to. And the systemic approach leads down the path to these multi-solve portfolio solutions that require deeper collaboration, a recognition of our interconnectedness across sectors, places, dimensions. And this is something that requires a new mindset. So thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking later.
Thank you very much, Eva. I think it was a very insightful conversation, and it perfectly sets the stage for our first panel of today's session, because she has been discussing about systemic thinking, about the importance of long collaboration between different stakeholders, between different sectors. So for that, I would like to invite in Martin and Mikael. Please join me on stage. Just to start diving in under conversations, maybe I can give a brief introduction of both of you, so we really dive in. Here on my right, I have Mikael Nordlander. He is the Director of Partnership at Vattenfall, a Swedish multinational power company and one of Europe's largest producers and retailers of electricity and heat. Before, he was the Director of Industry Decarbonization, an area and responsible of hybrid, and other collaborations aimed to directly electrify the industry. And then also with us, Martin Pei, Senior Advisor at SSAB, a Nordic and US-based steel company with a focus on high-strength steels and related services that has developed a fossil-free steel. He's also the board chairman of Hybrid, and he was the executive president and CTO of SSAB. So welcome both, thank you. Okay, something I think will be very interesting to start this first panel is something that I was simply mentioning when I was introducing you. I was mentioning both of them work on hybrid, but both of them come from different companies and different sectors. So I think this is something very interesting that we can start discussing. And maybe I will jump the question to Martin to understand, of course, first, what is hybrid, a bit of the background, and what has been achieved so far in terms of goals and expectations, and what comes next. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. Yes, Hybrid is a joint collaboration between 3 Swedish companies. It stands for Hydrogen Breakthrough Iron-Making Technology. It was created immediately after the negotiation of the Paris Agreement. So 10 years ago, we were facing all the question, how can we decarbonize the steel industry? As you all know, steel is essential for our society. Look at this beautiful building. Everything we live today with producing food, drinking water, or the airports, highways, everything we depend on are built with steel. However, steel is today produced with a technology that emits a big amount of carbon dioxide. So globally, steel industry stands for around 7% of CO2 emissions. And in Sweden, we, SSAB, produce steel from iron ore using this blast furnace technology, and we emit 10% of Sweden's CO2 emission. So back in 2015, when the negotiation final stage of Paris Agreement, in Sweden there was a discussion, how do we decarbonize the Swedish industry, Swedish economy? And I met Mikael at that time, and we had a common understanding that if we do this jointly, we maybe can develop a technology that can solve the CO2 emission question of steel production by using new technology. And essentially, we decided to explore to use hydrogen instead of using coal, that is today widely used, to produce steel from iron ore. And hydrogen should be produced by water electrolysis using fossil-free electricity. And with that, we can produce steel from iron ore, make these high-quality steel products without essentially any CO2 emissions. So we decided to launch this initiative in 2015, and we invited, in addition to SSAB Vattenfall, also LKB, the mining company. So we created a joint venture company, and then we started to invest in a very extensive development program. We have carried out a 6-year pilot research program, and that program has been accomplished. And we have, in this joint collaboration, shown that the technology using hydrogen to produce steel without carbon dioxide emissions actually works. And we started in our joint research program, develop a steel product that was launched on the market already in 2021. So since then, we have been delivering limited quantities of these products that are sitting in cars, in trucks, in machines, in wind towers today. Many of our customers try this material, and the technology is proven that works at this semi-industrial scale. So very good success in the development work, and now we are implementing this technology. So SSAB has started the investment program, and the first facility will be already decarbonized next year, end of 2026. And end of 2028, we are going to commission a very big investment. With these two investments, we will cut Sweden's CO2 emission by 10%. And we have another step is to decarbonize also our operations in Finland. Hopefully we will do that around 2030. So this is a great journey we have done. Very much thankful to this very fruitful collaboration.
Thank you. No, and it's true how amazing, no, when you work together, like great things have been accomplished, many milestones have been achieved. And something I recall when we were discussing this panel and you were mentioning, Mikael, is not just a breakthrough technology, it's transforming an entire value chain. That's why different players are together. So jumping to you, the next question will be then about these learnings. No, you were also since the inception in 2015 of hybrid. So what have you learned along the way of transforming an entire value chain just beyond a breakthrough technology?
Well, how many hours do we have? I mean, we essentially, if you take one step back and think about what we have done, we have decoupled fossil fuels supply to a whole industrial branch. And what we are now doing instead is connecting this industry with a new type of energy supply. And I mean, simply you cannot do that as individual companies. You will have to cooperate. And I think you also can understand that by cooperating and having the full value chain perspective, it also makes you more powerful in a way that you can optimize this. I mean, we have had a chance working closely together with SSAB and LKB to develop the technology in a way so it fits the power system as we see it will develop with more, for example, more weather-dependent power. And also how you transform the electricity to hydrogen, how you store hydrogen has been developed into this project as well. So the knowledge we have been able to bring from our different companies into this joint venture and the full value chain perspective, that has been the most important thing, I think, to be able to paint the whole picture. And it doesn't really stop with the steel. Along the way, it was also tagged along the customers. As Martin described, the volumes that have come out has already been applied.
Yeah.
So we really developed the full value chain into the customer applications. So we're not stopping by producing a material. We're really changing the business on the customer side.
Yeah, definitely. And what you were also mentioning before, like how you have already developed this successful pilot, a huge milestone, no? After almost 10 years of developing trees, a lot of trust, a lot of collaboration, no? A lot of willingness of sharing the same values and the same mission to be aligned on that. But I know many fail in reaching this pilot. This is a great success, but then it comes the next phase you were also briefly mentioning, and it's the scale-up, the industrialization, and then different challenges come to play, apart from much larger investments and so on, but very few succeed on that. So maybe, Martin, you can share with us, no? What do you believe that, considering the example of hybrid, it elevates hybrid beyond a promising pilot, and what gives you confidence, that it can be scaled and replicated?
Yeah, the technology scale up is of course important, that we need to work very carefully, and we are very good at the engineering, so that technical aspects we feel rather confident we can handle. But the major challenge is really scale up of the commercial viability of such a product. And with that, I am very happy to see that on the way, when we started to deliver these trials, small volumes, and then we got a lot of very positive feedback from our customers. Because without a market demand for this decarbonized steel, big decisions for investment to change technology will not happen. And in our case, we have been able to really secure strong enough customer demand, and then now we move ahead with this big investment program. So policy framework is important. Certainty in policy regulations will be extremely important going forward to keep the momentum, so we really can decarbonize the whole economy.
Yeah, definitely is important, because when I was introducing it's important, this cross-collaboration between sectors, between different companies, but it goes much more beyond. It goes also to the customer side. They need to be aligned with you. They need to be willing to try this product, to embrace it. And then, of course, policymakers, they are aligned. So many different stakeholders come to play in this regard. And maybe this question is relevant for both of you. Like, you can bring different perspectives, definitely. And it's about understanding cross-collaboration. This cross-collaboration between industries, sectors, different stakeholders, but also how can you do it with increasing complexity in production processes and also with globalized supply chains?
I mean, given the complexity of a value chain, you simply need to cooperate, because, I mean, we don't have time to rebuild the energy system and then start transforming the industry. This needs to happen in parallel, and it happens in parallel. So by building these value chains, you minimize the risk for all by cooperating. And I mean, Martin touched upon the demand. That's a really vital point, because it also follows a logic. These materials, these industries, steel, for example, is not a, sorry, Martin, very expensive product. But if you initially face a slightly higher cost, you could perceive that as a problem. But the good thing of having the customers on board is that once you make this steel into a product, the extra cost on the product might not be that severe. I mean, if you add a couple of €100 in extra steel cost on a car, a couple of €100 on the price tag of the car doesn't kill the case. It could rather be a selling point. Because, I mean, in the end, if you pay 1% extra for a product, eventually what we all will avoid is the externality effects of climate change, which is far outweighing the extra cost we need to transform. It's a lot cheaper to transform than to take the burden of climate change eventually.
Yes, touching upon this really is the collaboration that we need to have in the whole ecosystem, because this technology shift that we want to go away from using fossil energy in producing steel, steel that is used to produce other products, this is a very huge undertaking. We have a lot of areas we need suppliers and partners to make their investments in order to enable our big plans and so on. So this is very, at the same time, exciting technology shift. I think we need to see also the opportunities that this brings to further develop our business, become long-term more sustainable.
Definitely, and I feel very much aligned because this is what we do in our organization. EIT Manufacturing is an innovation ecosystem, so we truly believe of different stakeholders working together to really push faster things forward. And in that regard, coming different players into play, it's also important the context you are at. No? So bringing now, we have been discussing a bit more on the ground examples like success stories, what things are doing right that are very inspiring, but let's zoom out and maybe let's talk more about the context on where you are developing it from a European perspective, but also from a macro perspective, from a macro one. And in that regard, I would like to ask, and again, I think maybe it's relevant for both of you, the question, maybe we can start with Martin this time. Like, given this global context, how is important for Europe right now to be at the forefront of decarbonization?
It is important for Europe to continue the journey because we have been among the first runners to start really to do this development work, develop the technology. Now we're ready to really go to full scale, decarbonize the whole economy. And this is, we are facing a lot of challenges at the moment, but we should not lose the sight because getting independent from the fossil economy, that's in the long run the best scenario for Europe as a continent. So we need to be determined, overcome, say, short-term difficulties, continue to make the right investments, decarbonize our economy, and become more resilient in the future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, from a European perspective, I would say it's close to existential. I mean, there is sort of a misconception in my view that Europe has a chance to be competitive based on fossil fuels, which is clearly not the case. I mean, China has the coal, the US has the gas. We import, and we base our business in the energy sector and eventually in the industry sector on imported energy. So, I mean, the switching to a green economy is basically our chance. So whether you talk about resilience, whether you talk about energy supply or competitiveness, it doesn't really matter. I mean, there are upsides to do these shifts anyway. So, I mean, in that case, it's really essential now that Europe stays on course, don't wobble on the goals, but keep on track. And I mean, from the industry side, what we can do is to prove that it's possible, that we can show that this is the best path to go. And in a way, we can reinforce each other between policymakers and the industry to keep on the path.
Exactly. It's an urgency of now. We don't need to think in the long, mid-term. It's an urgency that we need to implement right now. And in that regard, Europe, we can say, is very strong. And for example, the policies, the regulations, on AI, on data, on sustainability, the European Green Deal, now the recent Clean Industrial Deal. So in that regard, it's also important to discuss this context, and maybe I will jump to you, Mikael, because more on energy related, like what do you think will be the most critical enablers, but also maybe the bottlenecks in today's policy and regulations that are impact your ability to support this energy transition that you are trying to bring on Vattenfall?
Very recently, we did a survey in Sweden among major industry companies and asked them, what do you think are the hurdles? I think we asked some 15 companies or so. And on top of the list, now bear in mind that this is Swedish conditions, and Sweden is an odd corner of Europe where you have loads of cheap, clean electricity. So that was obviously not on top for the Swedish companies. But on top of the list was the consistency and the long-term belief in the climate goals in the EU. Second place came grid connections and infrastructure. And I think there you have two excellent examples of the role of what the governments can do. As I said, stick to the goals, but also, bet on infrastructure. We need to reinforce the infrastructure. It's good already. We have excellent knowledge about electricity infrastructure in Europe. So keep on developing that to facilitate both on the power production side and on the industry side. For you, if users and producers are better connected, everyone will benefit from that.
Yeah, definitely electrify the grid, and this is also related, talking about the context like we are doing right now, on the economical context that we are, and thinking that, taking that into account also, like I will understand maybe Martin, but please feel free to react, is what do you think will be the European economic incentives that are really supporting this decarbonization journey, and maybe if there are, where do they fall short? So in your case, how do you think will look like a truly supportive investment ecosystem?
Yeah, Europe has been really leading the putting a cost on the emissions. That has been very important for us to come so far. The emission right trading system with the decided phasing out of free allocations, that will continue to push for this green energy and industrial transition. That is a very good starting point. I think in the long run, it's need to continue the journey to be firm on the goals, but also create the possible conditions for companies to operate, increase the long-term competitiveness, because that is what we as a manufacturing company in Europe will live on in the long run. So create good infrastructures like grid connections, electricity generation, push down the cost for those key elements in the production. And with that, I think we will continue to be prospering and developing well as a continent. That's very important.
Yeah, even supporting the smaller players, SMEs and so on, that maybe they struggle more to bring these emissions down. We have a little time left, but I think a nice way to close the panel is to bring a question for them to answer in 1 minute or less, considering the timing. And it will be decided on you if we end up in a positive note, maybe on, let's be aware note, on a negative one. And I would like to hear from both of you, how positive do you feel right now that we will reach these net zero goals?
From our perspective, SSAB, a steel company, we are already making the major investments, so we will reach our goals. In the Nordic countries, we will be decarbonized around 2030. Very strong commitment. This is among the most aggressive ones in our industry, and our customers will have an opportunity to utilize this and to build their value chain. So we are, as a company, very confident this will be done.
Thank you.
Martin and me come here from directly from Stockholm. We had a party yesterday night celebrating the final phase of the pilot project. So we actually come directly from finalizing the pilot phase. So it's hard not to be positive today. We've proven that it works. So technology is there. I think as Martin says, the investments are coming. It's easier in some parts in Europe than in others. I have full respect that there are challenges. We could do better on efficiency of permission processes, not less rigorous, but at least more precision in timing. We could do better in the infrastructure. We could do better in clarity on that we're keeping the course. But overall, I'm positive. We have so much good things. We have the knowledge. We have a huge internal market. We have still a political course that is stable. So yeah, I'm positive.
The willingness to do so. So I think that's a perfect way to finalize this first round of panels. So let's thank our panelists. Thank you very much for all your insights. And now I think it's time we move on to the second panel of today's session. First of all, I would like to invite our speakers, Josep Maria Recasens, Edward Bouygues, and Wendy Woods, that maybe they can join. If you allow me, before jumping into the questions, I will briefly introduce you so we can start talking interesting things during the conversation. So here on my right, I have Edward Bouygues. He's the Deputy CEO of Bouygues Group, a diversified service group operating in 4 sectors: construction, energy and services, and media and telecommunications. Also with us, Josep Maria Recasens. He is the Chief Strategy Officer at Renault Group, the international car manufacturing, and also the CEO of Ampere, an electric vehicle and software company that was founded in 2023 by the Renault Group. And also here with us, Wendy Woods. She is the Vice Chair, Managing Director, and Senior Partner of Boston Consulting Group. She works with organizations to create sustainable energies and partnerships that help clients create a positive impact in the world, strengthen their market competitive position, and build resilience. So thank you, the 3 of you. I think we have finalized this first panel with a very positive note from our panelists. So maybe let's keep the good tone of conversation. Let's keep hearing inspiring stories. And especially the high-profile panelists that we have here today that you can lead by example. And as a first question that maybe will go to Edward, I would like to hear from you. Let's talk about examples, how we can lead by examples. If you can share one tangible thing that you are doing today that is truly changing the decarbonization curve, but not thinking in the long-term net zero goals, but now. Now.
Well, actually, I can maybe share 2, if that's okay. In the Bouygues Group, we're first taking action for our own emissions, of course, like I think most companies, and it's measurable. We've already reduced our emissions between 23 and 24 by 1.5 million tons of CO2 equivalent out of a total of about 21 million. So that's through changing the types of vehicles we're using. Our cars are also industrial vehicles, and through all the other classical actions. And then there's the second one, which I think is very important, is we offer solutions through several of our businesses for our customers to reduce their own emissions. And I can come back on that, but for example, Equans offers lots of solutions to change the equipment that you're currently using in your company, in your factory, for example, to make it a more efficient equipment, for example, changing the heating systems to heat pumps, and that's an immediate gain.
Definitely. So there is the internal gain, and your customers also winning from that.
We're working on both.
In a really hard-to-abate context of the construction sector. So then keeping this line of questions, of great examples, and so on, and maybe jumping to Wendy, because you work with different companies, so you will really know different sectors, and maybe Josep Maria, also the perspective of the automotive sectors, and it's like, let's be a bit honest, and I would like to hear from you, if companies are really implementing actions in their decarbonization journey just by own requirements, because they have to do so, and if so, if you could please share a concrete example, starting Wendy.
I can share many examples because, frankly, there's an awful lot of organizations and companies that are moving way beyond what's required because there's an opportunity to go beyond what's required. At BCG alone, our emissions from our 2018 baseline are down more than 50%. right? That's a significant change. That's actually cost saving for us. It's a good thing. And when I look more broadly at companies, we work with a CEO Alliance of Climate Champions under the WEF umbrella. They have reduced emissions more than 10% already since their baseline. They've got about 10% of the global emissions baseline. They're in 12 sectors, they're 27 countries. This is not a narrow slice of the economy. This is a broad-based slice of the economy, 10% down on a very significant percent of the global baseline. Europe's at about 3% reduction right now. The US is about 2%. That's way beyond what is required and faster than much of the economy is moving. Totally doable. A third thing I'd love to talk about is something called the First Mover Coalition. First Mover Coalition is an organization of companies that say, we don't want the stuff that's somewhat decarbonized. We want the products to go into our supply chains that are maximally decarbonized, that pushing the boundaries on what's possible. SAF at 90%, 95% carbon reduction, aluminum, steel, very heavily decarbonized. First mover creating advanced purchase commitments, helping manufacturing scale up, and actually doing offtake now. And so groups of companies coming together to send the demand signals that allow a much, much faster scale up happening across some of the harder to decarbonize industries. So there's an awful lot that's happening now that goes frankly well beyond what is required in any geography.
That's inspiring. Josep, Maria?
I think that before giving you the answer, I think it's important that everybody understand what obliges us the legislation as of today, right? We as a car manufacturer, we are obliged to comply with a certain limits of CO2 emission in our fleets. This is the law, and this is what we have to comply. To answer your question is, what do we do more than complying with the CO2 emissions in our fleets? Well, what we have taken as a decision as a group is to tackle the entire value chain as a whole. Not only the tailpipe emissions, which is the law, the CO2 emissions in the exhaust pipe, but the entire value chain. What does it mean, the entire value chain? It's the cradle to grave. So we take the entire supply chain, we take the entire supply activities, our assembly lines, the development, and the commercialization, and we try to lower down that carbon footprint, right? So imagine, for example, how much carbon footprint does it sounds? Hola? Does it work? Yeah? Okay. Imagine a carbon footprint of a standard vehicle, 50 tons equivalent of CO2, right? So if we would only tackle one portion of that, which is the law, we would lower down maybe 80% of that carbon footprint. We want to do more. What does it mean? We work in the upstream, we go to the materials, to the supply chains, to the assembly lines, and we reduce the carbon footprint with sourcing panels that allow us to reduce that. But it's not only that, it's also to use green and renewable energy sources to lower down the consumption in our plants and in our supplier park. And not only that, in the life cycle, we want to recycle all materials to have a perfect closed loop. So this is what we do on top the legislation obliges us as of today.
Thank you, and I think this that you're mentioning of really addressing the whole entire chain is something that I would like to bring on later on because it's a great point of discussion. And I think it's also important, as you're mentioning, like we need to tackle many problems, many challenges. So let's put the focus now a bit on the challenges that we are facing right now. And one of them that we cannot ignore is, of course, how is the fast-changing context that we live at, no? And when we are talking about decarbonization, we are talking about net zero goals that are in the long term, 2050, 2040, that requires, of course, strategies that define long-term objectives. But in that regard, and I think it's a question relevant to all of you, maybe starting with Josep Maria, no, the Chief Strategy Officer of Renault Group, is in this fast-changing context, how can companies define sustainable strategies?
Well, what I would say is that sustainability, or even ESG, if you want to call it like this, is well anchored in our strategy, right? So 100% anchored in every decision that we are taking. I'm going to give you a couple of examples, right? So decarbonization. Decarbonization is a fundamental pillar for the Renault Group towards the next decade global emission reductions. But not only, because sustainability goes beyond decarbonization, even though decarbonization is a strong pillar. It's also about our people, right? in the sustainability path, there is a responsibility from our side to go along with our employees and workforce and transform them. So programs of upskilling and reskilling our employees are also very important in our strategy. But also safety standards. So we are a car producer, we are commercializing vehicles, and beyond the regulation of a star rating, we want to offer really true matter safety standards in our vehicles, just to name some of them.
Thank you. I don't know if Edward, Wendy would like to react.
Sure. Would you like to start, Wendy?
You go first, Edward.
Thank you.
I'll follow.
Well, in terms of adapting, I think any company, any business has to constantly adapt. That's a given. I think in our group, where we're lucky in the Bouygues group, is that we're a construction company first. And in construction, you're always adapting to your client's needs. Everything we build is a prototype. It's the first time we build this specific type of building, this specific type of tunnel, of bridge, hospital, or anything else. So we're always adapting, and by adapting, we also try to bring this constant adaptation towards sustainability. So for example, our customers are asking us for new solutions that use less concrete, because we all know the emissions of concrete. So we're teaching our workforce to work with wood, to build using wooden structures as much as possible. You can't do everything with wood, but you can do many things, like some of this stage, for example. And we're working on these solutions. We're also bringing solutions to our customers in terms of how their building can be better conceived and use less energy for heating, cooling, etc. And that's the kind of long-term business with our customers that we're having.
And it's interesting because we are tend to think we need innovation, we need technology, but maybe this solution, it seems like low tech, and
the ones that have the most impact at the moment are not the coolest shiny inventions. They're sometimes very simple things. For example, when we take care of the lighting in large cities, most of them are using sodium bulbs, which use a lot of energy. We change them by LEDs. Okay, it's not super spectacular, but it's a 70% decrease in electricity consumption for lighting in that city. And that counts.
Yeah, definitely.
I think the most important thing that we're talking about is that it's not a sustainability strategy on the side. I think what you're hearing from all of us is that it's sustainability embedded in the corporate strategy, embedded in the business strategy. It's not about doing something separate, it's about saying when we do procurement, how do we make sure that it's also green and therefore also cost saving? How do we actually think about our supply chains and make sure that they are sustainable, resilient, and inclusive? It's not about doing things separately, it's really about just embedding those principles in everything that we do with our strategy, because that's when you actually both capture the opportunity of sustainability, but equally important, capture the value.
Yeah, so at the heart of the organization, in their mission, in their vision, they truly need to believe on that. But of course it's a challenge. So keeping the focus on challenges and moving a question very much focused on Josep Maria, because I would like to talk about the automotive sector that is suffering major sweeps. We all know that. I would like to ask you, like considering that you are very tight on regulation, the fines, on carbon emissions, and so on one hand, but maybe on the other hand, in some countries, in some sectors, maybe there is no full customer acceptance on these electric vehicles. I would like to hear from you, how do you see the future of the automotive sector, and is this your biggest challenge you're facing right now?
It's a good question, right? So everybody is asking me that question, how it's going to look like the automotive sector in 10, 15 years, right? I can explain you a science fiction movie, right? But the truth is I'm going to mistake, because everything is going to happen faster and the transformation is going to be deeper than we can imagine, right? So our ability is how to manage uncertainty and volatility, right? How can we keep the pace of competitiveness and profitability without jeopardizing sustainability and climate change objectives? This is our major challenge as of today. But at the same time, how can we guarantee competitiveness? Because we can discuss hours and hours about sustainability and climate change objectives, but if we do not make it guaranteeing, believe me, guaranteeing European sovereignty and competitiveness, everything that we are debating here will be over, right? We can discuss about all that because we are competitive. As long as we are competitive, we can debate about that. If not, it's game over.
Thank you. And in that regard, I would like to bring back what you were mentioning before, like you are working all across the value chains, because it's true that many companies are really successful in reducing high percentage of carbon emissions, especially on Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions. But I recall, Wendy, when we discussed this panel a couple of weeks ago, you were mentioning that actually you are working a lot on Scope 3 that in many cases represent the largest amount of the carbon footprint of a company. So in that regard, maybe you can share with us what is the most effective approach to tackle these emissions, and especially considering complex and global supply chains.
Well, it's the largest, usually Scope 3 is the largest amount, but it's also a huge risk for companies. I mean, I'll point to another auto company that had a flood in one of their suppliers. One flood, one supplier, and they had the largest single intraday stock price that they'd ever had because they ended up having to delay delivery of more than 1,000 units, right? It's also incredibly important right now to be building adaptation and resilience into the supply chain to defend against the extreme weather that we're seeing more frequent, more severe related to climate change. So let me start there. But what you're talking about, Reka, about working across supply chains, unfortunately, in the latest CDP survey, it's only about 4 of every 10 companies that are really engaging with their suppliers and engaging proactively with their supply chain. And that is a massive unlock when that happens, both in terms of the economic of what's possible, in terms of decarbonization, improving sustainability, improving resilience, but also just the fluidity and the extent of the magnitude of what actually can happen and how that value gets shared across it. One of the places that we've been working across the value chain is with Dow Chemical. And we worked with them on something called a carbon footprint ledger, which is how do you actually get the greenhouse gas emissions and the understanding at a product level, and how do you actually trace that value through the supply chain and the intent of sharing that value through the supply chain. And when you actually engage with suppliers, both sometimes, and many companies are starting to put requirements on their suppliers, but also in terms of the education, the support, the sharing of the digital tools across the supply chain, again, that can unlock a lot of what's possible. And it also changes the equation on the economics. If you look at a lot of the steel costs, fully decarbonized steel may mean a 50% increase in cost at one stage of a value chain. But to put fully decarbonized steel in a car, it's probably about 2% of the end cost of the car in terms of increase, because there's so many other components that go in. And so how do you start thinking in terms of whole value chains? The whole value chains of suppliers working together, both to build that decarbonization, but also to build that resilience.
Maybe building on that, right? So I think that there is a kind of co-responsibility action to be taken very seriously in that respect, right? You are mentioning supply chain, responsible supply chain processes or management, right? But it's true that, we like it or not, let's accept that decarbonization implies an extra cost, right? So how many of the customers are ready to pay a price premium for that extra cost, right? You have an European-made vehicle that maybe is 2 times more expensive than a non-European-made vehicle, maybe not compliant with ESG, maybe not compliant with sustainability, and maybe not decarbonized. What is going to be the selection of the customer at the very end, right? Because if the customer does not buy the story that decarbonization, sustainability, ESG are real return for the European society, then why are we doing that if the customer is not asking that? So that kind of dilemma, that kind of question has to be well addressed by everybody, right? And accept the constraints and the extra cost that decarbonization implies.
Definitely, and actually that's what I wanted to ask you next, because this is critical when we need to talk about competitiveness. Competitiveness, we tend to think more sustainable products, more expensive production processes, more increased prices for our customers. So maybe a question all of you can answer, maybe, but we can start with Edward. We don't have much time left, but it's critical that we discuss that. No, how can companies balance this decarbonization and profitability and still remain competitive, especially talking in international markets, working across different countries and sectors?
Yeah. So we don't see decarbonization as only a cost. It is a cost sometimes, most of the time, but it's also for us an opportunity to sell new products, new solutions to our customers. And we try to always present it with the payback time or the ROI, so that our B2B customers understand that they can recoup their investment. It's an investment, really, and they can recoup their investment sometimes quite fast. Equans has started a new a company called Carbon Shift, which groups all of our decarbonization solutions. And when they'll visit your business, they'll visit your factory, for example. I'll take your number at the end, and we'll call you and visit some of your factories. And they can list everything we can offer, from the fastest ROI to the longest. And some of these investments will save you tons of CO2 within 1, 2, or 3 years. Yeah. Some of them are longer, but many are very quickly recouped, and then you start making money after those years. So this is something of an opportunity to us.
Excellent.
I would just add there is a huge diversity across industries in terms of the cost of decarbonization. There's a lot of industries where it's really tough and it's only a small percent of the cost, less than 10%, where you can actually do cost savings. There are other industries where you can get 50% of the carbon out and you're actually saving cost. And so the diversity across industries means that the opportunity for what you can do in a cost and carbon way is highly, highly diverse.
Yeah, thinking sustainability across the 3 legs, no? Environmental sustainability, financial sustainability, and social sustainability. 2 minutes left, so maybe we have time for this final question again, like a final remark, like a closing to this session. A question for all of you to be answered very shortly. And it's okay, let's imagine, let's be positive. We have reached those net zero goals. We have decarbonized the industry. Then, what do you think will be the biggest challenge that will come next? Maybe it's now here and we don't talk about it enough.
Well, what I would say is that we have to guarantee, when we have reached that kind of net zero goals, that we have done it in a very fair manner, right? Maintaining a competitive industrial and technological ecosystem in Europe, that it has not diminished our ability to generate wealth and progress across the society, because it has to be our fundamental goal, right? That everything that we are doing as an economical actor, all that beyond rewarding the shareholder, which is our mandate, we also transfer that progress into the society. This has been the speciality of Renault Group in France, but of the entire automotive sector in Europe. And I think that this is the crucial element to guarantee for the next decades to come.
I'd build on that and say society needs to thrive. And to do that, we also need to make sure that we address all the elements of the just transition. We're going to lose a lot of jobs in the green transition. It's going to create more jobs, but they're not always in the same places. It's not always the same skill set. And so how do we actually make sure we're addressing the human side and really enabling society to thrive through the transition and after?
Thank you.
I think what we saw in the previous keynote, the starting keynote, was that there's not just, you can't just do one thing that's going to save us all from the problem. It's going to be a massive amount of little things that are going to contribute to reducing our emissions and making us more sustainable. And we're still in the learning curve. We're trying things and we see that they destroy something else, so we stop and then we try another one. I think the future is going to be all about balancing all these different things that we do, all these actions, recycling, reusing, etc., to get to something that works for us and our planet.
This systemic thinking approach, bringing all together into play. So I think it's perfect, excellent way to finish. Thank you very much to the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that was the last panel of today's session, but still we have the last part where we will have a keynote speech where we will be discussing about the challenges that the automotive sector faces, what we have mentioned, this dual disruption of electrification and connectivity. And for that, we will bring on board Cléa Martinet. She's the Vice President Sustainability at Renault Group, that she will be joining by Josep Maria Recasens. And they will be discussing of what it means to be, join me. Jeez.
We have already been talking a little bit about decarbonization and challenges of the automotive industry before, right? I would like to, whoops, work, yes. So I would like to give you a little bit with Cléa, a little bit more of that challenges and how sustainability has played a fundamental role in our strategy, right? So we can skip that.
Yeah.
So as I was telling you before, right, many people are asking me how it's going to be the automotive sector in the next decades to come, right? What I invite you is to do a flashback with me, right? And come back to 2010. And those are some of the elements that have described the automotive industry at that time. Just focus on the three below, right? Tesla, right? At that time, Tesla was doing the IPO with 1,500 roadsters in the US, 2010, right? China, Chinese OEMs were failing miserably in entering in Europe because of lack of quality and reliability, 2010, right? And in 2010, nobody was talking about CO2 emissions. Nobody in 2010, right? So this is 2020, early 2020s, right? So Tesla, right? Everybody knows Tesla. Everybody knows the capital market value of Tesla, right? Everybody knows that Chinese is landing in Europe, and not only in Europe, but across the planet, right? And we talk about CO2, no, we talk about banning ICE vehicles in 2035. In 10 years, from 2010 to 2020, right? And that in the context of a scalable and mature technology. And the question is, if the world, if the automotive sector has changed so much in 10 years of a stable technology, a stable economy, and stable geopolitics, what is going to happen in the next 10 or 15 years to come, right? Because the reality is that we, Renault Group and our peers, we have never faced so many challenges simultaneously as today we are facing. Decarbonization, digitalization, ultra-regulation, a tsunami of regulation, right? More than ever, price volatility, technological volatility, next generation skills, upskilling and reskilling our workforce, and last but not the least, geopolitical tensions. But if there is one element that is crossing transversally all those challenges, is decarbonization. And why do we talk about decarbonization? Because we are shifting from combustion engine business to EV business, right? And why we're doing that? Because we want to decarbonize, right? It's just an example how we, Renault Group, are we decarbonizing our vehicles. From a 50-ton equivalent CO2 of a combustion engine diesel, right, up to 50% reduction just because we shift from combustion to EV. But at Renault, we don't want to stop there, as I was telling you before. We want to continue with more levers in the upstream, in the supply chain, with low carbon footprint materials or low carbon footprint batteries or green energy, especially renewable energy. And all those levers will help us to decarbonize more and more our vehicles. Let me explain you the complexity that we are facing from shifting to the ICE value chain to the EV value chain. It looks pretty much the same. 4 phases: materials production, use and recycle. But the components, the technology, the elements, the variables in the ICE value chain have nothing to do with the ones in the EV value chain. And more than that, the players are completely different. So you see European American flags, Japanese flags on the upper side, and you see Chinese flags. And not only the region or the countries are important, the players, the suppliers, the OEMs, the source of energies, the miners, the drillers. So everything is different. So the question that Cléa is going to answer is, with all that panorama, with all that paraphernalia, right? How a group like us, Renault Group, is taking action to face all those challenges and to succeed, because we have succeeded so far. We came in 2020 from the worst result ever in the company to posting the best result ever in our 120 years history. So please, Cléa.
Yes.
You can.
Fine. Yeah, because going electric also comes at a cost. If you take the production cost of an ICE vehicle compared to an electric one, you take 60% plus. So it makes the challenge even more dire for us. So what we did, Luca De Meo in 2021, that's our CEO, he announced a strategic plan called the Renaulution. And in the past 4 years, this plan has been to address in the most sustainable and competitive way the energy transition challenge. What we did is take a bold bet and say that France and Europe would be where we would produce our electric vehicle competitively. To do so, what we did is localizing in northern France 2 electric vehicle assembly plants, 1 battery casing factory, and 2 battery gigafactories, all in northern France, plus our e-powertrain factory in Normandy, a couple hundred miles from there. And that created a logistic and competitive ecosystem that contributed to reaching minus 40% of cost from 2023 to 2027, 2028. So that's the industry background. From a workforce point of view, we didn't start from a clean state, so to speak. We're a legacy industry. We had a workforce entirely skilled to produce ICE engine and vehicles. So what we did was organize a complete transformation of skills, upskilling and reskilling through the Renault University, concentrated on 3 poles: circular economy, electrification, and data cybersecurity. In the past 4 years, we've upskilled and reskilled nearly 40,000 employees in France and in Europe, so that the transition would be inclusive from a workforce point of view also. And what we did also was to reduce our exposure to raw materials volatility and to the very center of minerals refining, which is China. To do so, we invested in a circular industry loop with the future is neutral, and considered end-of-life vehicles, which are waste, as a resource, and create short closed loop on steel, aluminum, copper, and in the midterm, minerals, contributing to, I won't say restoring a sovereignty, but at least some form of independency on a European-made energy transition. And finally, that's the behind the scenes, you know. I told you about industry, about workforce, about circular loops. This is what you have on the roads. We're making our way from C-segment family vehicles ranking from 30,000 to 40,000 euro to a more affordable range on the B segment with the Renault 5, Renault 4, and the Twingo ranking from 20,000 euros to 30,000 euros, making the energy transition inclusive also from a customer point of view. So we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go.
So, and this is the way we have to run, right? So this is the adoption curve expected to happen as long as we want to comply with regulation. Right? It's again a strategy driven by regulation, right? What does it mean? In 2030, if we, European OEMs, don't want to pay penalties, we, on average, we have to reach 55% of EV mix in our fleets, right? Today, in 2024, we have reached 13.6%. This is still a long way to catch up to that figure. Why? Because there is a clear tendency of early adopters, people that are just willing to get the new technology because they are trendsetters, because they want to be hyped, or even because they have the purchase power to buy that technology. But the remaining more or less 85% is asking 2 things. Give me affordable cars, OEM, right? And give me more range or sufficient charging infrastructure. If those elements do not occur, that 55% is just a dream, right? And it's our responsibility to put the conditions, vehicles, that make that goal happen. But we are necessary, but we are not the only ones to make it happen. There is a co-responsibility among different actors, the energy system, the financial system, the public administrations, and even the customers, in order to comply with those objectives. And the question is, how can we comply with that transition, with that transformation, taking into consideration what Cléa has explained you? Decarbonization, transformation will imply more cost, or is implying more cost for us. And at the same time, the majority of the OEMs in Europe have announced profit warnings last year, or very important ventures like the one of Northvolt has failed in the attempt of becoming a battery maker. How can we cope with that? So it's very simple or very complicated. We need to balance those three elements. So sustainability, yes, for sure. Profit resilience, yes, for sure. And competitiveness. We have to play with those three elements at the same level of importance. Putting one in front of another will jeopardize the others. So this is the equation that we collectively, we have to guarantee in order to succeed with each and every single goal that we have in front of us. Because if we do not make it so, what is at stake is what is written at that slide, right? Is the entire European automotive sector which is at stake, right? 7% of the GDP, more than 13 million jobs in Europe, net export contributor from Europe, and the big contributor in terms of R&D investment in Europe. This is what is at stake if we do not comply with that trilemma. I repeat, sustainability, economical resilience, and competitiveness. And the story, ladies and gentlemen, is going to repeat it. In the past, in the US, with fossil fuel, where the cost was far below to the Europe levels, the Americans have built big cars, heavy cars. What we have done, the Europeans, efficiency. We have created the small and compact segments in Europe. Clios, Polos, 208s, Megans, Golfs. That was our specialty. Our focus was efficiency, low consumption, weight and size. Now, with the EV, where the dominance is in China, where the exposure is in China, because of materials, because of battery, because of... the response is going to be the same. Efficiency. And which is the response? Small, compact vehicles with reasonable battery size at an affordable price. This has to be the response to that challenge. And what are we promoting? What are we calling for an action? Let's mobilize all the necessary resources, including with the regulator, what it's making Europe competitive and credible in terms of mobility. Small and compact vehicles, for the sake of competitiveness, for the sake of profitability, and for the sake of sustainability. Thank you very much.
Thank you.